Well, I always like to know sort of who our audience is, and if we were hosting the ambassador from Moldova, I'd ask how many of you have been to Moldova, but how many of you read the New York Times every day, just by a show of hands? How many of you read print versus digital? How many of you prefer print? How many prefer digital? All right, well, that's interesting. That was maybe 50-50. Well, today's speaker is Eric Schmitt. He's covered military and national security affairs for 20 years. He's currently a senior writer for the New York Times, covering domestic and international terrorism issues, occasionally in the fray from Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Mali, and Southeast Asia. He's the co-author of Counterstrike, the untold story of America's secret campaign against Al-Qaeda. I understand that we have a few copies of his book available for sale. If you're interested to buy a copy and have it signed, that's always a great memento, and it's a really interesting read. His visit is part of a partnership between BYU and the New York Times, in which like I mentioned, we provide access through free papers we hope that you're taking advantage of. Today's topic is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and terrorist threats to the U.S. at home and abroad. Please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy Center, Eric Schmitt.
Well, thank you, Corey, for that very warm welcome. Appreciate the Kennedy Center's sponsorship, and it's my first visit to BYU. It's a wonderful campus and a beautiful setting you have here. And thank you very much for getting me out of Washington. We'll see if we get a speaker today, at least from the other side. That's the big news out of Washington today. A friend of mine was asking me the other day, I hadn't seen in a long time, said, what have you been up to, Schmitt? What's going on in your world? And I come in, oh my God, let me tell you, we've got Russian fighter jets that continue to pound Syrian opposition targets on the ground there, trying to prop up the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. You've got more than a year after the Islamic State rolled into northern Iraq. They're still dug in the western part of that country, as well as eastern part of Syria. And not only that, but they've sprouted affiliates in some 8 different countries, ranging from Nigeria and Yemen all the way up to Afghanistan, and are proving to be a much more sophisticated and savvy foe on the terrorist front than even Al-Qaeda was. There appears to be a possible brewing intifada in Israel. And in Yemen, home to the most dangerous Al-Qaeda affiliate, you still have very much of a civil war that's raging there. Saudi-led air forces have come into that country and are trying to push back rebels that have pushed the government out. Tragically, however, though, this campaign has been marred by a number of civilian casualties for that bombing. In the words of the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, the number of Sunni violent extremist groups, members, and safe havens is greater than at any other point in history. So I'm just struck looking over the past year in the shifting nature of national security and terrorism threats, and in how many ways the United States is limited in how it can confront these challenges, the forces that have been unleashed over the past several years, particularly since the Arab Spring. And as I look at it as a terrorism correspondent, national security correspondent for the New York Times, I kind of put these threats in 5 or 6 different buckets. One is this conventional threat. And thankfully, the threat from Al-Qaeda itself, the threat in Pakistan, has been greatly diminished over the last several years. The ability of Al-Qaeda to launch a large mass-scale casualty attack like they did on the original 9/11 is much less than it ever has been. But as we've seen just in the past week with the President's decision to halt the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan, at least for now, keeping about 10,000 troops in Afghanistan through the end of next year, and maybe half that many by the time he leaves office in 2017. The Taliban is still a very serious problem, and there are indications now that Al-Qaeda may be infiltrating back into Afghanistan as well as the Islamic State. So that conventional threat, while it's still diminished, is still a major issue. There's a new emerging terrorist threat, though, and that one that has probably surpassed Al-Qaeda in terms of its threat to the United States and perhaps even the threat in the region, and that is the Islamic State. And it's different in many ways from Al-Qaeda in that this is essentially a hybrid terrorist army. They've taken the elements of what used to be the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq and morphed it with leftover members of the Ba'athist regime from Saddam Hussein who form a military background, and they've combined into a very potent force on the ground that's being able to actually control territory First time a terrorist organization has done that effectively in swaths of territory from eastern Syria into western Iraq, a size of territory about the size of the United Kingdom. So that's the second group. It's kind of this emerging terrorist threat that sits alongside the historic threat that we have, the traditional threat from Al-Qaeda. There are other groups that have formed that I'll kind of call a third group, and they're kind of a subgroup of that emerging threat, and that is the kind of the splinter effect. These are groups that really haven't made up their mind exactly where they want to be, and I put this, say, one of these groups is Boko Haram, which is the Islamist extremist group in Nigeria, probably best known to most people for their kidnapping of some 300 schoolgirls in that country just a couple of years ago. And now Boko Haram has pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, making it one of its so-called affiliates, but it's also very much kind of active in the West African context and independent in a sense that maybe other affiliates might not be. So there's another complicating factor for policymakers in Washington is how do you deal with the splintering effects of these groups that may not be part and parcel of the overall larger group, but have split off on their own and perhaps even more extreme elements. We've seen a kind of a back-to-future tendency of state-sponsored terrorism, a thing that was quite common in the 1970s, and we've seen more of it with Iran. And even though there has been obviously the nuclear deal that the United States and its allies have struck with Tehran and its leaders, Iran remains a very powerful and troublesome source of aggression in very many parts of the Middle East. You see them on the battlefields in Iraq right now, fighting, coincidentally on the side, in the same battlefield against ISIS with the United States. But you see them in Syria as well, helping prop up the government of Bashar al-Assad and fighting against the opponents, the rebels that are on the ground. You also see their effect within the Gulf itself in places in like Yemen, where they have supported the Houthi rebels that have pushed out the government there, and there's signs of their kind of mischief throughout the Gulf region. So that is another deeply concerning impact, even as the United States has been able to strike this very important political deal on their nuclear program. Here in the United States, we have our own concerns with homegrown terrorism. And while maybe the best known incident of this was just a couple of years ago in the Boston Marathon bombing, just this past July, there was a very tragic situation of a young gunman in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who took up arms and assaulted a naval training center there, killing some 5 service members. This was a lone individual, what they call a lone wolf. And this is a troubling trend because this is the kind of attackers that law enforcement, both the FBI and police, find the most troublesome because there's oftentimes very little sign of warning that the authorities have before these strikes come. And then just finally, as we round out this bucket of half a dozen or so kind of terrorist threats, there are the so-called cyber threats. Some would put Edward Snowden in this box, the former NSA contractor who divulged many of the secrets of the NSA, including the fact that the NSA has been monitoring different accounts of United States citizens. But it's also in the context of increasing number of foreign hackers. These be state-sponsored, perhaps China from Russia, perhaps Iran and North Korea, that not only attack government servers, but also the private sector, as we've seen in the banking industry, petroleum industry, and the financial sector. This is one of the greatest challenges, perhaps on a technology side, that American counterterrorism and intelligence officials face today. So America is at a real crossroads, I would say, right now, with its involvement in the major land wars in Asia, in the Middle East, and Afghanistan slowly winding down. Yes, with these fits and starts that we've seen in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but the goal here now is to draw down to fairly low numbers. But the threat they faced, but unlike the Al-Qaeda the U.S. confronted on September 11th of 2001, the threats today are much more decentralized and knitted together by Islamic extremism that's deftly propagated over Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. That is really one of the major differences the Islamic State, otherwise known as ISIS or ISIL, has over its predecessors or other organizations now. So what are the tools that the U.S. government, working with its allies, has now to combat these multiple threats? And are they adequate for the task? On the one hand, you have the traditional elements of military power, and we're seeing that play out every day, particularly in the campaigns in Iraq and Syria, where we see American airstrikes carried out, oftentimes with allied contributions, and on the ground, Americans working with partners, particularly in the case of Iraq. But this has been very problematic as well, as we've seen with the recent problems that we've seen with American training Syrian rebels in doing that. So you have a military component. And the problem here is that the United States and the administration has, in its shifting away from those large land wars, has banked a lot of its future success on a new strategy. It's called the light footprint. That is the idea that small numbers of U.S. forces, oftentimes special operations forces, will go in and help train or advise the indigenous military or law enforcement capability. The whole idea here is that the United States or its other allies will be able to enable these local forces, which have the skills of knowing the language and the culture of the enemies they face on the ground, to be much more effective in going after those. This is the challenge, though, as we go through in places like Yemen and even in Pakistan and Libya, where some of these partners often can become unreliable. You see right now the United States is working very closely to try and dry up the finances of some of these terrorist groups. This is a challenge. But perhaps the most dramatic challenge is kind of the one I alluded to before. And that is, how do you combat the propaganda of these terrorist organizations, particularly one such as ISIS, that is broadcasting some 90,000 tweets a day, multiple languages, at various audiences around the world. Come join us in the caliphate is their siren song. Come join us and be a part of something new. It's a very attractive lure for a range of people. The U.S. is trying to obviously not do this alone. One of the lessons, and we talk about in our book, is how, after time, U.S. policymakers and military and other officials learned that this has to be a whole of government effort. It can't be just the military. It can't just be the CIA or the FBI. It has to be all these agencies working in concert together against a common enemy. But it just can't be the United States alone either, because Al-Qaeda and now ISIS are transnational organizations. These are terrorist groups that do not respect boundaries, and thus it's not enough for the United States on its own, even taking a leadership role, to go it alone. You need coalitions, and that's of course what President Bush started first. President Obama is trying to do it now. There was a little bit of a lull at the end of 2011 when the United States drew down its forces in Iraq, and it looked like maybe this larger terrorist threat had gone away, or at least subsided to the point where local officials could take care of it. We took our eye off the ball, I'm afraid, in that period of time. The U.S., the Iraqis, Afghanistan, and allowed the threat in those countries to regenerate to where we are today and having to come back at it with another full-fledged effort. It's a policy we see in Washington right now, even though it's a whole-of-government approach that involves different agencies, including the State Department, the Justice Department, Treasury Department to go after finance. It's still more than ever, though, I'd say, a policy, a foreign policy, and national security policy that's driven from the White House. It's tightly controlled there, and I think increasingly for the sake of President Obama, as he's now approaching the final year in office, there's a deep concern among his top advisors of the legacy of this president. That's not to say he's not considering all other options, but they're very, very worried and very concerned about what happens with the president's legacy and all that. We've seen that just in the last several months with the restoration of ties in Cuba, a very important victory for the president's foreign policy. We've seen it with the Iranian nuclear deal. Against all odds, that has been accomplished. We'll see what happens in the future as we go through with it and see how the Iranians implement it. And now, of course, we're looking at these two major wars that President Obama desperately wanted to be able to say, I've closed the chapter on these wars, at least the American combat role. First in the war in Iraq, now the war in Afghanistan. And it's become quite clear by the time he leaves office in January of 2017, there will be American troops in both countries. Exactly how many, we don't know yet. Exactly in what role they have will probably be in large part how well successful this counterterrorism campaign will be over the next year or so. Let me quickly unpack kind of the challenges that are faced in those different buckets as we go through. Because starting with the first one, as I mentioned, the threat from Al-Qaeda in Pakistan has been greatly diminished. But the big debate in Washington has been, over the last several months, how quickly and how far to withdraw in Afghanistan, of course, the original country that harbored Al-Qaeda. Originally, the plan was to draw down from the roughly 10,000 forces that were there at the starting of the year down to roughly 1,000 or so. 0 is too little, but it's about 1,000. But an interesting coalition of agencies over the last several months succeeded in persuading President Obama to change his mind. Now, the military weighed in because they felt, frankly, that their allies on the ground, the Afghan military, while making great strides, just needed more training. They needed more backup. So the military made a very persuasive case of why U.S. trainers should remain, at least in sizable numbers. The State Department wanted to support the new president of Afghanistan. Hamid Karzai and his longtime contentious relationship with the United States is out, and a new president, Ashraf Ghani, a technocrat, is in, but he's obviously facing the same kind of challenges that President Karzai did. But State Department, Secretary of State John Kerry is trying to do all it can to support this new president, who by all means has been a much more reliable partner within the U.S. than Karzai has. So the State Department had a stake in keeping more forces there that would help security of the country. The third group that had a stake in this is one that might surprise you because it's not advertised widely, and that's the CIA. The CIA continues to carry out covert operations using bases inside of Afghanistan to launch into Pakistan. This includes the drone strikes that, while greatly diminished since their peak of a few years ago, still continue. But the CIA is in a bind because if the United States military draws down to essentially an embassy-only force, they too would have to withdraw their operations, and that could mean a real significant reduction in counterterrorism capability. So all these forces, together with, I think, the lessons of what happened in Iraq. Remember when we discussed the idea that what actually happened at the end of 2011 when the U.S. did withdraw down to basically a much smaller embassy-only force in Iraq. Did that contribute to the problems that we're seeing there now? Did that contribute to the rise of ISIS in Iraq because there weren't enough American advisors on the ground to perhaps be the eyes and ears that could spot this resurgence coming back, who could have maybe checked some of the more extremist tendencies of Prime Minister Maliki as he replaced competent commanders in places like northern Iraq with more political cronies. We'll never know for sure, but that's one of the issues right now. The second bucket, of course, is that emerging threat that I talked about and how ISIS has really sprung upon the scene and frankly, took many analysts by surprise when it rolled into Iraq in the spring and June of 2014. And this is, again, as I mentioned before, kind of a terrorist entity we haven't seen the likes of before. It had its roots as an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq. And so it fought against the United States and Iraqi forces there for more than a decade and honed their kind of terrorist chops, if you will, doing that. But what they did was different was, at the end of 2011, when they'd been beaten down and the Americans had left, they were able to team up. They spread into Syria, and they teamed up with many of the former Ba'athist commanders. These are essentially the generals from Saddam Hussein's defeated army who fled into Syria, took refuge there. And they combined into this force, where you had the terrorist credentials of Al-Qaeda in Iraq married up with the Ba'athist commanders, essentially a military force. And so you had this hybrid terrorist army that when it rolled into Iraq in June of 2014, you could see both elements of it. They had done their planning very well. They had infiltrated the North and exploited the discontent that the North had with the government in Baghdad. But when it came time to push forward, they acted almost like a conventional army, enrolling right up to the gates of Baghdad and posing a really severe threat to the government there. So they built on that. They're now holding firm despite the Allied air campaign that's been going on for over a year now in Iraq and Syria. They've dug in some of the major cities in western Iraq, like Fallujah and Ramadi, and they've pretty much held their own in much of eastern Syria, despite losing some territory along the border with Turkey. So there's the problem there. But that's not all, because they've been able to sprout affiliates in a way that Al-Qaeda did, but only over many years, where you now have about 8 or so named affiliates for ISIS in countries like Nigeria and Yemen, even Afghanistan, that have many of which were existing terrorist organizations that have jumped on the ISIS bandwagon, but have created this aura that ISIS is now everywhere, that it's a global threat. As John Brennan, the CIA director, said earlier this year, the emergence of this terrorist threat that is increasingly decentralized, difficult to track down, and even more difficult to thwart. And that's one of the problems when you get to the third bucket, is this threat from Iran. even though we've now addressed, or at least for the time being, addressed their nuclear program, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and its Quds Force still play a very active role in the conflicts in Syria, in Iraq, in northern Yemen, and throughout the Gulf. This is something that the U.S. intelligence community and military is going to be watching very closely in the months ahead, as those commanders want to be able to show the world that just because their government struck a deal on the nuclear side doesn't mean they're going to tone down their activities on the unconventional side, which they do so aggressively. And then finally, looking at the homegrown threat, because this is one of the most nettlesome problems facing American policy officials today. And as again I mentioned in my introduction, probably the best well-known is the Boston Marathon bombing, which tragically killed some 3 people and injured about 260. But the instance of what happened in Chattanooga this July, when this lone gunman killed about 5 people in the Naval Training Center, is kind of illustrative of the challenge that law enforcement faces today. This was not somebody who was on anybody's real radar. There are right now so many of these individual lone wolves that the FBI or local police are trying to track, hundreds literally right now, that it's very difficult to spot every last one of them. And when they finally got to the computer of this individual, a 24-year-old gunman named Mohammed Abdulaziz, they found out that he had been, in the weeks leading up to his attack, researching Islamic materials to figure out whether martyrdom would lead to forgiveness for his sins. In his case, it was things like drunkenness and being deep in debt. So here was a guy who was very privately going through his own turmoil, who showed very little signs to the outward world that he could become the threat that he eventually did. And that's the challenge posing to the FBI now and the local law enforcement. All these people you suspect who may be on suspicious websites or extremist websites, all of which, of course, are protected by First Amendment rights. Which one of those individuals is going to take the next fatal step? Which one of those persons will not just be cruising through these chat rooms, will then pick up a rifle or make a homegrown or make a homemade explosive and carry out an attack on their own in a subway system, in a movie theater complex, in a shopping mall? That's the challenge that American law enforcement faces today. There are so many of these individual threats. And ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda was of the mind it had to be a big, spectacular plot. And a big, spectacular plot needs a lot of actors, a lot of players. And when you have that many people, somebody's going to give away a clue, a tip, and you can pull on that string and the whole plot becomes revealed. Not if it's just one person or maybe 2 people, being radicalized in the privacy of their own living rooms, of their basements, watching English language videos of ISIS propagandists, basically urging them to take up attacks wherever they can, however they can. And so while that kind of threat, obviously it isn't of the scale of 9/11, is much more prevalent. And that's when you talk to the counterterrorism officials today, they actually say in that way, we're living in a more dangerous time than we did on 9/11. And that while the threat against the United States today from a mass casualty attack is probably much lower, the attack of the probability of some kind of individual attack, like we saw in Chattanooga or we saw in Boston, is actually even greater. So what happens now that I've laid out this kind of cheery prospect for you all, this fall day? How does the government deal with these threats? Well, as I mentioned before, this has to be a whole-of-government approach as we tackle these problems. It has to be State Department diplomats working with their colleagues overseas, their counterparts overseas, to try and identify the root causes of what's creating the next generation of terrorists. It's FBI agents who are now deployed in much larger numbers than ever before to foreign capitals, working with their counterparts in law enforcement to try and detect the first telltale signs of a brewing terrorist strike. Obviously, the military and the CIA will play their traditional role in trying to contain and defeat and roll back the terrorist state, and particularly ISIS as we now know it. But there are other factors that are important as well. As I mentioned, some of the unsung heroes at the Treasury Department who are trying to dry up the financing that's really the lifeblood of terrorist organizations like ISIL. Right now, ISIL gains about $500 million a year from its oil proceeds. That is just the oil fields in eastern Syria. Maybe another $500 million or so from the taxes and fees and kidnap for ransom costs that they're able to derive from the people they control in their territory. So the goal here has to be to try and shrink that territory, shrink their ability to draw in resources and put them on the run. There was a hearing in Washington just yesterday with Secretary of Defense Ash Carter and the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Dunford, and they talked about the frustration they've had with the current campaign and how President Obama has basically tasked them, come up with new, innovative ways to go after this group. These ways are controversial. They're talking about perhaps putting special operations forces on the ground with some of the Syrian rebels there. This is after the Pentagon has basically had to pull the plug on its train and equip program because they just couldn't find enough rebels who wanted to fight against ISIS instead of Assad, the man who's been barrel bombing them and their families for the last 4 years. So here's a great challenge. And how are we going to work, the U.S. and its allies, going to work with and through these allies on the ground, be they the indigenous allies of, say, in Syria or Iraq, or in working with, say, countries like France in North Africa, the colonial power for a long time there, who still is very involved, or the Saudis in a country like Yemen right next door. These are the challenges. And it's important because one of the conclusions we come to in our book here is that the United States will probably be hit again by another terrorist attack. And not just an individual attack, a major attack. Because the United States, to be successful, has to defeat every single one of these plots. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they only have to be successful every once in a while to be successful. And even then, if they come close, they can claim that as a triumph, that they got that close against a power of this, a country with the power of the United States. So this will be the task. But how is it that a president can stand up, or any politician really in this environment, and say, we have to be strong, we have to be resilient because we will be struck again? That's a very difficult political message in this environment, this very partisan environment to do. But it's something that the United States and its leaders from the ground up have to do, because that sense of resilience that needs to be built up, this is critical. And it's a sense of resilience that countries like Israel and Europe, many European countries have had. They've built it up over time because they had to suffer through their own domestic terrorism, largely in the 1970s. But what they've learned how to do is, when the terrorists hit, they don't overreact. They don't give what the terrorists want. They mourn their dead, they pick up the debris, and they move on. And that's what we have to be, as a nation, have to be prepared to do if that next strike comes. In the meantime, it's going to take that whole of government effort, and as well as a global effort, to continue this years-long struggle, really is what it's going to be, to fight organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I'm going to stop there so we have plenty of time for questions, but I appreciate, again, your coming today and look forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
So we have a lot of time for questions. I encourage you to form a line here on the side. We're going to have to ask you guys to kind of squeeze back a little bit. Tell us your name, what you're studying, and please begin with the first question.
Hello, my name is Camilla Stimson. I'm a journalism major minoring in political science. What I'm interested in is kind of the U.S.'s opinion on, I can never pronounce his name, but the president of Syria. Because I'm just confused, is he good, is he bad? Like, I've heard so many conflicting opinions on him, so I wanted your take on that.
It's a great question because it's something that's in the halls of government in the United States now is one of the big questions. Obviously, President Obama has said President Assad, Bashar al-Assad, has to go. He has committed, in the view of many, war crimes against his own people. 250,000 people dead. Millions more have had to flee the country or displaced in the country. And so there is at least the goal now, the recognition of the goal in the United States is to try and transition out of an Assad government. The problem is he's not going anywhere. He wants to stay put, and his army is still fighting. And he has two very strong patrons backing him up, the Russians and the Iranians, who both have their own self-interest in keeping him in power, or at least another one like him. There's no really any love lost between Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and President Assad. I think many of you saw some of the film clips of Assad's recent visit to Moscow would see that there's nothing personal there. There's no personal appeal there. But Russia is very interested in keeping its position in the Mediterranean. Syria is one of its major arms purchasers. It's Russia's only port in the Mediterranean, so they want a presence there. Iran needs to have that corridor into Lebanon so they can have the contact with Hezbollah that's over there in that. So you have these two very strong powers that are basically saying we are going to keep Assad in power as long as necessary. And the kind of the dirty little secret in Washington is the U.S. doesn't want Assad to leave dramatically. They don't want to have a collapse of the government there. That they view would be catastrophic, and it would just only heighten this tremendous civil war that's going on. So the original goal was to put enough military pressure on him, hopefully to push him and his allies to the bargaining table where there might be some kind of means to transition to a different government in Syria. That's going to be very hard to do now, I think, 4 years into this campaign. The idea that any of the moderate groups, any of the people in Syria left now who aren't supporters of Assad will basically able to stomach this and have him or anybody in his circle stay in power. That's the struggle now. This fight has gone on so long, and the sides have all hardened in their position so much. It's going to be a real challenge, I think, to come to the political solution. It's really the only way that that conflict is ultimately going to end.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm Ben Peterson. I'm a Mesa major. But I think you basically kind of answered what I was going to ask just barely. But I was just going to ask about what do you think Putin's intentions are in Syria?
Well, again, I think Russia intervened because he saw a real danger of the Assad government folding. I mean, what's happened is that the opposition on the ground, much of it was supported secretly by the CIA, was actually making inroads. They were encroaching on Damascus, the capital, and the Alawite strongholds in the northwest part of the country. He was down to controlling maybe only 25 to 30% of his country, and Putin saw perhaps the loss of a client state there. So I think that's why you saw him weighing in now with the military campaign that he has. And it's also, he found it, rhetorically a good means to shift the attention away from the criticism that Russia's come under since their invasion in Crimea and their support of the rebels in eastern Ukraine. It changes the conversation there. It certainly has raised his already high popularity levels in the Russian public itself. And so I think it's unclear how long and how large a commitment Russia will be able to make to Syria. Once they get things stabilized, will he then back off? Will the Russians pull out? I kind of doubt it. The Russians have always had a position. There have always been advisors in Syria, the long relationship they've had. But he wants to maintain that hold on in his ability to maintain a position in the Mediterranean. And it's also, for him, it's a convenient way to tweak the Obama administration in the United States. I'm coming in and I'm going to make a difference after the 4 years of inaction that you all have been responsible for. That's his rhetorical line.
Thanks.
Hello, sir. My name is Philip Atoigui. I'm a political science major, but I'm also going into the Air Force after I graduate through the RTC program. My question, I actually just read this morning on the Times about the Pentagon's new plan to take on ISIS, the 3 Rs plan. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on whether or not it'll be more effective in taking on ISIS, given that we're still trying to have a kind of advise and assist role versus a active role? Do you believe that it'll be more effective in taking on ISIS, or will we need to escalate it in order to really be effective?
Sure. Just to explain to everybody in the audience what this is, yesterday at this hearing in Washington I alluded to, the Secretary of Defense talked about a strategy that's going to focus on 3 Rs. Raqqa, which is the de facto capital of ISIS in eastern Syria, Ramadi, which is the key city in western Iraq right now that is being defended by ISIS, and then raids. These are the kind of raids that special operations forces take, oftentimes going after the Islamic State leaders to gain intelligence. And I think what this is you're seeing a sharpening of existing policy. I think you're not really seeing a major shift. I think there's also kind of a tactical and political reason why they said this at the hearing today. I think the Secretary of Defense was trying to buy himself a little time and give himself a little space with the critics on the Senate Armed Services Committee led by Senator John McCain. He can come forward and say, we've done this review of where things are going right, where they're not going so right. Here are the changes that we're now looking at. He'll basically get the senators off his back for a little bit while they try and tweak things in the field. One of the major things they're looking at is inserting U.S. Special Forces into the fight into Syria to work with these Syrian rebels on the ground to enhance their capabilities, perhaps help more effectively call in airstrikes. We'll see how this goes over, because this is a president who has stiffly resisted the reintroduction of more troops, American troops, into Iraq, and he's basically drawn the line and said no boots on the ground at all inside of Syria. So this would be a change if he were to accept these recommendations from the Pentagon.
Hi, my name is Becca Dudley. I study international relations. I was interested in what you said about the prevalence that ISIL has in social media and the role that that plays in the radicalization of their fighters. And I just was wondering your opinion on what you think the U.S. and their allies, especially in Europe, who see these freedom fighters going and then trying to come back, what they can do to kind of stop the radicalization and the socialization of youth, especially like at its core.
Right. So this is one of the hardest things for the U.S. and its European allies to deal with, because the American message just doesn't have much credibility on the Arab street and in the Muslim world, particularly with that section of the population that ISIS is targeting. They're mostly looking at, young males 18 to 32 or 33 or so. That's their kind of sweet spot, if you will, for the kind of fighters. They're also, though, trying to attract young couples with children even, who can attract them, devout Muslims who are living perhaps in, say, one of the rings around Paris, where they feel alienated from the French society. And the appeal coming from ISIS is saying, come join us in this pure Islamic state where you will be welcome. You will be homesteaders, as a matter of fact. That's one of their appeals. So they can appeal with these bloodthirsty beheading videos to the young males in many cases. They have this other kind of appeal to the families, and then they have yet a third appeal for professionals, for the doctors and the engineers and others that can come in to help them run the state, oftentimes with offers of financial bonuses to come in to do that. So they're in many ways building on the social media approach that Al-Qaeda had developed, particularly Al-Qaeda in Yemen. That chapter, that was very effective in trying to make the case of why other people other than just fighters should come to Syria right now. The problem with this is, again, that the American message is not going to really is going to fall on deaf ears in most of those communities. So I think it's beholden, and what's happening now is they're trying to find credible Muslim voices who can try and counter this, come up with a counter narrative. And there's an effort that's just now beginning to try and find individuals who have escaped from the Islamic State, people who were originally drawn by this appeal, but have gone there and said, "Whoa, this is not for me. This is not what it's cracked up to be." Get them to come out and make video testimony to this, collect these videos, and put that out to on some of the same social media channels that ISIS is doing, and combat that narrative. These people would presumably have much more credibility, since they've been there on the ground and had to escape, often for their lives, to do this, than some American politician or American general or somebody in Europe doing the same thing. But it's hard to get that whole activity pulled together in a way that's going to be effective.
Interesting, thank you.
Sure.
I think you answered part of my question at the end of hers, but as you spoke about the
Tell us
importance...
your name.
Oh, sorry, I'm Jalen, and I'm a journalism major. And as you talked about the importance of the reactions that we have to future terrorist attacks, I was interested to know what you felt like the media's role is in combating terrorism.
Well, I think that we have in the media, both in print, Times. Obviously, we're online and digital now is our focus. It's the tendency, I think, even in our profession, but certainly in television and some other aspects, is to be alarmist. How do you? And this is a problem that the U.S. government has had. How do you inform the American public of a possible plot without crying wolf, without sounding like, oh my God, this is going to be the next, great assault on the United States? And this is a challenge that the government faces, but it's also a challenge that we in the media face, of how do we moderate this? How do we not play into fear-mongering by any government, whether it be the United States or one in the West, doing this? And yet, how do we also do our traditional job of informing the public of here is really where the threat level is, and here we've done our reporting, and here is what we've learned that this plot really is and what it really isn't. And so I think there's a role we all definitely do play, and not to get sucked in our desire for greater ratings or for selling more newspapers or more clicks on our website, or our digital feeds. We have to be very careful in doing that and be measured in trying to explain what this threat is and what it isn't. Sure.
Ben Peterson again. Just wanted to ask about what do you think the long-term effects that immigration will have in Europe in the context of homegrown terrorism and the immigrant crisis that is now happening?
Well, it's obviously a big concern for many of the countries there, because there's the fear that ISIS will have infiltrated militants among these great waves that are flowing into some of these European countries right now. These countries have set up screening mechanisms in some of the refugee camps that they've established for these folks coming up. So it's something that both these countries in Europe and, frankly, the United States is watching too. The United States, of course, has said it would allow several thousand of these immigrants into the United States over the next few years. And so already the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security is ramping up their efforts on how do we make sure that we're not letting in unwittingly some type of militant who could carry out attacks against these countries. So it's something that's on the minds of people. I think the sheer numbers of migrants coming into Europe right now is actually more of the issue right now. How do you just deal with these people? Where do you put them? How do you feed them, clothe them? How do you take care of them? How do you distribute them throughout Europe? That's been the big debate, I think, through the European Union. Yes, there is a concern about whether you have ISIS infiltrating spies, but as of yet, it's not been one of the most prominent concerns among European leaders. At least that's my sense.
Do you think there'll be long-term effects with immigrants, or those, I don't know?
Well, certainly on all these countries, particularly if these individuals are allowed to stay there. I mean, that's one of the big questions, whether they'll be allowed to stay and be able to live in these countries long term, or whether they'll be viewed more as economic immigrants and then ultimately be sent back or turned away. That, of course, is this whole question of whether they're economic refugees or asylum seekers that obviously would face persecution, injury, or death if they were to return to their home countries, which, of course, many from Syria and Iraq claim they would.
Thank you.
Sure.
My name is David Shorten. My majors are so old they're forgotten. I want to throw you a little bit of a curveball. Memories in the Mideast go back centuries and decades, and I was wondering, do you see the ISIL, as kind of a son of the pan-Arab nationalism that was in effect before World War I ended, and we created our French and British cousins created the artificial states of Iran, Iraq, Kuwait. Do you see this as kind of a resurgence of this trying to unite all Arabic speaking? I know the Iranians are Persians, but do you see this as kind of the son of that movement trying once again to unify the Arab Islamic state or world?
Well, thanks for your question, sir. I'm not an Arab scholar, so I'm a little reluctant to get into historical comparisons with this. We focus more on the kind of the evolution. Obviously, terrorism's been around for centuries and used as a tactic and a tool. Kind of modern terrorism here, as we've seen it in the Middle East, can usually be dates back to the Marine Corps barracks bombing in Lebanon in 1983, and you kind of go forward from that. Other examples, of course, are there. We focused in our research in our book, primarily on that period after 9/11. So I don't think I'd feel really comfortable making an informed, analogy or an assessment to these historical trends, other than to say certainly, you're looking at parts of the world here that where you have had borders, artificially created over the decades, and now we're seeing some of those borders being erased. Frankly, the border between Iraq and Syria right now, ISIS is effectively erased. What will happen? What will happen to the former state of Syria? Okay, will it ever be put together back as it was, or are we looking at something very different, almost a balkanization, if you will, of that country? Ultimately, we don't really know how that's all going to play out on the ground or in the diplomatic channels.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We have 2 more questions.
Hi, sir. My name is Josh Von Trapp, and I'm a Middle Eastern Studies major. There are some in the international media community, such as those at Al Jazeera, that purport that the U.S. isn't entirely sincere in its fight against ISIS due to I guess, a lack of arming, for example, the Kurdish army in northern Iraq. And so I was wondering, like, what your opinion on that is. Like, is it just a shift of U.S. policy against arming other groups that could potentially turn on us in the future, or what exactly is the reasoning behind that?
The short answer is it's complicated. And the reason it's complicated is because you're dealing with all these multiple governments. In the case of arming the Kurds in northern Iraq, you're dealing with at least 2 other sovereign countries that have a vested interest in this. You have the government in Baghdad, which doesn't like the idea of the United States directly arming Kurds in their country. And right now, the American policy is that they will provide arms to the government in Baghdad, and that government will then allocate those as they see fit up into the forces in the Kurdish forces up in northern Iraq. There's also concerns of Turkey, however, obviously, which has a very different view of Kurds as allies or not, both in Iraq and in neighboring Syria. And in fact, even as Turkey granted permission for the use of Incirlik Air Base, at the very same time, they started launching attacks against PKK positions in northern Iraq. And I think that took some Americans by surprise when maybe it shouldn't have, and how, you know, the United States has been trying to distinguish between the Kurds in Syria, who played a very effective role, somewhat surprisingly so, in rolling back ISIS from that border, that swath of border along the Turkish frontier, with the Kurds in northern Iraq that Turkey considers terrorists. How do you deal with that? And of course, the United States needs Turkey. That's an ally, a NATO ally, of course, too. And they also are supporting the government in Baghdad. So they're having to juggle all these various priorities, but also deal with the fight on the ground. And so far, the only opposition group they've found that's both effective and reliable are the Kurds. And so that's why you've seen some of the kind of the rhetorical gymnastics that the U.S. has gone through to emphasize that when they drop ammunition, as they just did recently into northeastern Syria, they're not arming the Syrian Kurds, they're arming a group that's working with the Kurds, some Syrian Arabs. And we have reporters on the ground trying to find exactly who these Syrian Arabs really are. Do they really exist? Or are they a kind of a fiction that's being created to siphon, able to redirect these weapons to the Kurdish fighters that need them? That's kind of one of the tricky kind of political and diplomatic challenges that the U.S. faces in this region as well.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Rachel Fosnat. I'm studying Russian and Chinese. And I was wondering, so if we could get rid of ISIS and get Bashar al-Assad out of Syria, what would America's next actions be for Syria?
You mean if those problems were ever to be resolved? Yeah. Well, there is this thing called the pivot to Asia that Obama keeps talking about, in China. And you saw with China, I didn't even mention China, but obviously China, just this week, here are the Chinese building islands out of sand in the middle of the Spratlys, and the United States sent a destroyer right through those waters just to remind the Chinese we're not accepting this as your new vision of truth, this your new vision of sovereignty. So I think we haven't talked about it in this discussion. It's not really part of this lecture, but certainly the relationship with the U.S. and China is one that's playing out right now. It's not going to wait for the resolution, whenever that may come, in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria. That's playing out in real time as we see every day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for your questions and thanks for your attendance. And please join me in thanking Eric Schmitt.
Thank you.